It's my hope that the much deeper meanings behind the title of today, Taking the Lost and Found on a Journey to Life, it's my hope that that is becoming much clearer about what that means for both the lost and for the found, and the journey idea and keeping people moving forward towards life and all its fullness. Before moving to the next part, I want to look at just address a particular issue, and that's a potential misunderstanding. One of the challenges we face from putting my NCD International hat on, is that in some movements we come across people who feel like they are kind of coerced or pressured to have to use NCD, and then it feels this sort of pressurized environment, and there's awkwardness that emerges around that. And I know certainly right from Christian Schwartz and myself, the desire is always that people engage in the NCD process because it simply makes sense in their heads, hands and hearts. And in instances where it is applied more coercively, invariably it doesn't go as well anyway. So it has to ultimately make sense. That's the preferred position. But at the same time, we never want to by that convey the idea that, oh, you can take it, you can leave it, that there's, behind whether you've taken a survey or not, there is a reality of the health of a call, for example, sitting behind that, but it doesn't matter too much. Far from it, we're saying the implications of that are absolutely enormous, and for me saying with almost 20 years of data on the Army, this focus towards the back door, the 6 more groups, etc., is gigantic. And if I could get everyone focused in their individual ministries towards that direction, I'd be delighted, because the impact of that would be absolutely gigantic. But to unpack this misunderstanding a little bit, we look at some of the phraseology used sometimes in discussions. And there's terms like, we have done NCD. And it's a true statement in a sense, in a small sense, but it's a bit like, we have done world peace, or, we have done healthy diet for the rest of our life, or something like that. Because you may have done a survey, but the process itself is an ongoing thing. And even if you don't take the survey, the health dynamics are still affecting everything that's going on in the background irrespective. So we then try to work out, okay, what's behind that sort of language and how do we address that? Another one is, NCD is one of the tools that we offer. The difficulty with this one is it ends up in what I'd call a category confusion. It's like saying, is an apple red or is it a fruit? And it's not a logically consistent question in and of itself. And this can make it difficult because for some, there's various programs happening in different directions, and then someone says, oh, here's NCD as well, how are we going to fit that in amongst all the other bits and pieces happening? But it can be helpful to try to clarify what these categories actually mean. So if we put it in terms of this sort of language, we speak of principles, and from an NCD perspective, we have the international research that says, here's this set of 8 principles, and here happens to be the profile for the UK territory at the moment. And the issue with principles is they always matter in that given context. There's never a time that they don't matter, so they have to be addressed. There's simply no escaping that. We can't sort of find an exclusion clause that says, oh, well, maybe in this context we can disregard that and everything will still go swimmingly. They simply have to be addressed. But then on another layer, we have models. And this can be all manner of different expressions. So it can be programs and strategies and action plans and intensives and college curriculums, retreats, all sorts of different things that fill that space. And so sometimes when people say, oh, NCD isn't the only thing that we do, it means it sits side by side with those things. Now, the interesting point about NCD is it doesn't really tell you what to do. It says here is a principle that has to be satisfied, and it may be, in this case, holistic small groups. What that will look like in the Salvation Army will be very different to what it looks like in the Adventist movement, where I do lots of work, where they also happen to have low holistic small groups, which is historically interesting since the two movements were born about a year apart. So there's something you researchers, theologians and historians might want to look into. But nevertheless, the outworking of the principle will be dramatically different, and even down to the core level, what it looks like will be completely different. What we can't escape is that it simply has to be addressed one way or the other. There's no getting around that. And if we don't address it, we should have no realistic expectation of anything suddenly and wonderfully, the birds chirping and the flowers coming out and everything turning wonderful into the future. If that was the case, someone would have, found that and would be firing that at NCD and saying, we've found that your research is wrong, and it just hasn't happened. So we have to address that level no matter what. But yes, exactly.
It's not just a principle, it has to be addressed.
Yeah.
It's not a legalistic thing.
No.
If we want things to change.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So depending on the motivation, because in some cases we say, no, we don't need to address that at all because we're quite happy with how it is and we're quite comfortable in the place that we're at. Sorry. Yes.
But also, I think part of the beauty of NCD is it does give you suggestions.
Certainly.
When you said we don't, actually, I think that's one of the stronger points, because I think our core often gets to we recognise the problem, we've got no idea what to do, and I think the beauty of NCD is it will give you 20 possible ins that if they're not ideal, they will point you in that direction. I think that's... So I think you're underselling that.
Well, I guess I'd rather go that side in some sense, but there's a reluctance from us in NCD because of the deep weddedness to the principal picture to never want to prescribe that, yes, if you take this, this will work in that context. And so we edge towards the suggestions in a way to say, well, within reason, if you have a look at this, it won't kill anything and it might be helpful, so see where that goes. But that leaves a huge space though, because once you reach that point, there's a gigantic layer, this whole top layer that has to be filled and has to be contextualised, and no one in NCD International can possibly do that. And you have to contextualise that at the movement level, down to the division level, down to a core level or centre level, right down to the team level. It has to be given life, in that space. And so there is enormous, because sometimes the feeling is that the NCD enthusiasts would like to kill off all other strategies and just have everyone doing NCD. But that would never get anything done because it has to be contextualised. There have to be incredibly creative ideas put together about how to make that live out, or it simply won't fly. But to clarify the category is important. So certainly, as we look at this, the model layer must complement and bring to life the principal layer. So if the models and strategies and actions and all the stuff that's put together that is highly contextualised, ideally, it must approximately complement that picture. So if you've got loads of strategy and training and whatever else on need-oriented evangelism, it's not really complementing the picture. It's overstacking what is already doing reasonably well. Now, that doesn't mean you don't do any of it. And as Salvationists, it would be impossible. It would be genetically impossible to not do something more and creative about need-oriented evangelism. So no one says to stop that. But proportionately, there just has to be a lot more done at the other end. So if there is that layer in the top, if it's difficult to see anything specific or strategic or programs or actions or whatever else that is addressing that lower end, then there's a gigantic question mark. And as I say, there shouldn't be any realistic expectation of change happening into the future. So that's part of trying to clarify that. And as you mentioned, we do offer some tools in certain levels. And what we try to do is we inch towards that. So we have things like the NCD discipleship tools, there's the cycle starters, and these things that just try to reach a little bit further. But in NCD terms, if we can get to the point where it catalyses and people say, I get it now, that's great, now run with it. Develop something fantastic, whatever that happens to be. There is a problem that some, again, NCD enthusiasts say, it's terrible, they've taken a programmatic response to dealing with their results. And Christian and I say, that's the most normal thing in the world. You have to construct something that is meaningful and makes sense and has steps involved in it that relates to the context. The programmatic response historically is only a problem when you keep building programs for the things you're already strong in, and you just keep doing that, expect paradigm of insanity, and you just hope it's going to make a difference. Whereas if there were creative things, and I hope there'll be fantastically creative things that come out of all kinds of core and centres, and every expression of NCD ministry, it says, how do we make those groups and teams more holistic? And I think there's a capacity for that. Just overhearing the discussions here, there's plenty of understanding of what that stuff looks like, and to put that into something systematic and methodical and consistent would make a huge difference. But at the end of the day, as I say, it's simply that I can't offer anything, and no one else on the planet is offering anything of a global research perspective that is suggesting anything other than what's roughly appearing in the bottom there is exactly what has to be addressed one way or the other. So I hope that's helpful because sometimes the messaging can become a little bit confused that what NCD provides starts pretty much at a completely different layer, but it not only allows for, but it requires an incredible level of creativity in the model and training and all that sort of layer. So I'd love to think, creative minds getting together, looking at, training college curriculum and saying, well, we know if this is underlying culture, we know we'll need at least some bias within our training curriculum that points a bit towards how to develop those teams. Because wherever these cadets come out of and go to serve, no matter where they are, chances are they're going to face that. And so to equip them to deal with that without even having a survey done is, that's a low-risk strategy and potentially extremely high-impact strategy. And at the same time, it wouldn't surprise me if that would potentially woo further cadets into training as well who had more of the shepherding orientation to fly the flag and say, you know what, we need a whole bunch of you guys in this place coming through because for the sake of the evangelistic side, we've got to start stacking the deck a bit and build that on the other side. So I hope from your level and different layers that can give rise to some creative options and things to explore. Okay, so we come back to our friends here. Now we've had the pastoral look, focus on the two people. And so for those non-pastoral, task-oriented people who would prefer to check their phone during that sort of discussion, we now switch to the more strategic side. And both equally important. I'm not presenting one as more important than the other. But if you're more task-oriented and you look at it and say, oh, good gracious, look at the round wheels. Imagine what we could get done if we simply harness that and move with that. That's a little more of the focus of this next section. And that takes us to this second lowest area in the profile of effective structures. Immediately, what is instructive about the positioning of where these characteristics are with respect to the back door and front door is that effective structures and passionate spirituality sit right in the centre, which means pretty much equally they are important to address front door issues and back door issues. You need people who are passionate to address front door concerns and spiritually passionate to address back door concerns. In terms of structures, you have to have both in place or the whole thing falls down. So this simply means, in terms of backdoor structures, we must care for and develop the workers from the harvest. So we were approaching it pastorally before, but you've got to put something structurally in place. As I said, it could be some sort of program. It could be extra questions that we ask when we meet as a team, things we don't usually raise or talk about. Or it could be as simple as saying the structure I do is when I sit down with my team, I put my phone and diary to the side, completely out of hand, and I focus on them as a person. Well, that's the structure as well. It's a process, it's a system I put in place to make sure that I'm taking a more pastoral approach with my team members. So there's all manner of different backdoor structures that have to be developed, and as we see, that's the larger focus. We've simply got to get better at putting things in place that address that. But then on the other side, it's essential, we do this a little bit better, but there's still plenty of headroom for growth. Make the best possible use of those people from the harvest for increasing the harvest. So how do we open the front doors even wider with a greater diversity of ministries that harness those unique gifts, the collaborative ideas that have emerged, the passion that people have, so that our capacity to meet those many different diseases and issues and whatever that are in that depictive picture of the maladies of society, that we're able to address more and more of those and simply see a much greater harvest. So the natural question then is to try to work out what exactly do we mean by effective structures. So imagine a little story for a moment. Salvation Army UK territory has been given a small tree, and it's been given the responsibility to nurture this small living tree. And we've pooled the greatest minds across the territory. There's a problem because there's no gardeners in the Army of Sardis, but nevertheless, it only makes the illustration more significant. So we're pooling together and we're saying, great, we've got the whole bang lot of us to look after this tree. This could go spectacularly well, or it could be a complete disaster. Nevertheless, here's the tree, and we've been given some good data that says that the winds are going to be increasing very soon and will be having an impact upon this tree. How are we going to make sure that it doesn't get broken or it doesn't get unduly bent in those forces and potentially destroyed. So we have planning meetings, we have focus groups, we have all sorts of strategic, come on, throw them at me, you've been part of them all, planning sessions, post-it notes, and goodness knows what, coming together to try to strategiise and work out a new way to approach this challenge. And so we're just simply saying we need a way to prevent this tree from breaking or falling over. With all the greatest minds meeting together, we have hatched a strategy, and with great fanfare and the staff band playing at it, there is the announcement that there is a new structure in place that's going to take care of our little shrub and make sure that it doesn't bend unduly from the winds. And the structure is... and it ticks the boxes. The tree is now not going to be subject to the winds that could potentially break it. So we all applaud and we move off into the future with great expectations about the growth and fruitfulness of our little tree. A little bit mean perhaps, or not, at various levels. But it does start to illustrate for us the issue of saying, when we're trying to put structures in place, do we understand what we're trying to do? What's the purpose of putting structures in place? And one of the chief points about structures is to understand what is it that we are nurturing in the life. So first of all, our eyes are on the life. We're not looking at structures, we're looking at the life and constantly asking, what does that need for the sake to be nurtured and to grow, just like a person, to its next step along the journey. So we put structures in place to support that growth. So clearly, isn't that exciting? Wow, burn away the dross. So bit dramatic. So we take that away and instead we say, well, what would satisfy those concerns? Well, probably that'll do. Like, we don't need much more than that. And that has come from simply looking at it and saying, well, what did it need? And what is available to it? It has sunlight available to it. So it's going to need to continue to receive that because we want it to steward the sunlight. That's a resource coming from heaven that is available, and there's water in the ground, there's nutrients in the ground. All these things are available to allow it to grow. It just needs a little bit of help along the way. So whenever we're putting structures in place, it should only be for the sake of making sure that the life and potential is carried further. And my observation of Salvation Army history in the earliest stages through this extraordinary boom phases, I don't know that William Booth sat down and wrote a 5-year plan necessarily with multiple strategic steps and various things like that. That doesn't mean it was all completely chaotic, but I think their sensitivity to what God was handing to them at every point was extraordinary. And the ability to say, well, here's this person newly saved and they seem to be passionate about this, or here's these 2 young ladies, 16 years of age. Yes, they're well suited to put on a boat and start the work in the USA. What else do they need? They need a boat, maybe a couple of Bibles. There you go. There's a sufficient structure to make that happen. Pretty extreme and quite nimble, but nevertheless focus on the life and what support at a minimal level is needed, because if we go beyond that, it's going to be like a tin can. We're going to crush it, so we need to be very sensitive to what the demands are at that time. So we can say effective structures support the best possible use of all resources. They look at what's available at that time and try to work out how do we make use of all of that, whatever is available, as much as possible. Now that's a bit idealistic, but you at least have to have the aim towards that to say, in this environment, in this group, in this core, in this division, in this territory, what do we have available and what do we have to put in place to make best possible use of that? So we're not starting with the concept of the structure. The structure is secondary, always must serve the picture. It's exactly the same as, a Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The structure of the Sabbath concept was put in place to support the development of man, not the other way around. And then further that, what must we use better to make sure it doesn't just disappear out the back door? This is the personalisation of this for the army. So any structural questions are largely then focused on saying, what are we losing out the back door? That's where our adjustment, either removal, adjustment, putting in place of structures of whatever kind should be focused on, because that's our most critical issue. Perhaps in some other areas we're not completely satisfied with structures, but they're fit for purpose and they're okay at the moment, but we need to perhaps address them in other areas to make sure there's the capacity for that collaborative exchange, that drawing out of people's potential, that feeding into them, whatever is needed to maximise the potential of the people along their journey for life. So the bigger picture of stewardship, time and well tested over time. Time, treasure, and talent is actually a really quite smart typology for understanding the overall picture of the sorts of things we have at our disposal and that we should be stewarding as well as possible. And part of it from a leadership level requires us to think as broadly as possible, to develop the perception for what is truly available to us. So when you're involved in formal leadership roles within the army or any movement, the tendency is to perhaps be mindful of the time, treasure and talent available directly in your jurisdiction. So what staff time do we have available? And we need another staff member maybe because we don't have enough people hour time to get the job done. Or we can look at how many people we have in corps across the territory and how much time we have of them in formal activities within the life of the army. Of course, when you look at it, that proportion of time is very small compared to the number of hours they're awake. So if they're awake, and if we assume for a moment that they are relatively inclined towards the principles and purposes of the army, even when they're not in formal activities, so you could say, as a Salvationist, still a Salvationist when they're not at a formal army gathering. One would hope so. Sometimes it might be questionable, but for the most part, they're inclined towards the purposes of the army. So that begs the questions about structurally, well, how do we leverage that even further? Well, this is very normal stuff. Once you leave on Sunday, what impact are you going to have in the world? But it's becoming a bit more strategic about that and saying, well, what do our people do in that space? Because that's time available to us, and we need to be mindful of how to steward that. So these are all stretching things. You can't solve it overnight, but we at least have to expand our picture. Treasure's the same. We can look at the budget sheets, the assets sheets, the number of buildings, all the stuff that's available in the finances per se. But a characteristic of very, very healthy churches is that they sneakily and quite effectively make use of treasure far beyond that. So I was at a rural corps in Australia once, and quite a poor poor-looking corps, and they felt a bit downtrodden and not many people there. And so I went, well, what resources do you have that could be harnessed better for the sake of growth? Well, we've just got this whole building and it needs work and needs attention. It's a bit cold in winter, and so we don't really have many opportunities. There's not much we can do. And I said, do any of you live in houses? Oh, of course. Do you ever think of that as part of the treasure available for the ministry of the church? Like you could have have you got a warm house? Oh yes, my house is warm. Well, that could be a place where people could gather and do things. And it's a characteristic of very healthy churches that people do make use of their homes, even their businesses, where there's business people, and they start small groups in the lunch break and do these sorts of things. So the vision is larger about the assets and treasure and resources available and creative ways of making use of that. So it's another extension so that we move away from, we don't have enough in the budget, we don't have enough money for this sort of thing. We say, well, maybe that pool is limited, but we have to stretch our understanding to the wider picture of what's actually available. And then in talent, it's even a little bit simpler. I mean, there's two levels within this. One is if you have people pushing the cart who are committed and are active, but it's not according to their giftedness, there's talent going to waste, full stop, because they'd be much more effective in something else. But also, if they're going out the back door, that's simply just talent disappearing. It's not even available directly at the moment. So in all these areas, we have to expand our viewpoint and see the resources available. With that increased vision, it informs the structures, the little stakes we put in here and there that will just provide that, will just nurture that into life a little bit more. So the structuring process becomes much less an occasional gigantic upheaval and restructuring of things to a finely nuanced process that's always attentive to the plant and the needs on the given day that it may have. So in your ministry context, then the questions are, how much untapped time is available when you take that expanded view? And you might only have one extra little idea about additional time available in some form, but that's a significant step that you can take. How much untapped treasure is available when you get creative about that, how much untapped talent is available, all these sorts of things to explore. But stewardship ultimately comes down to the topic of decision making. And if there are something like maybe 10,000 people involved in the army, be it staff, be it members, volunteers, that's not an unreasonable number across this territory, 10,000 people, then that's an enormous number of decisions being made every single day. Every one of those people are making a whole pile of decisions every day. So there are millions of decisions being made every week in the overall context of the Salvation Army. And every one of those decisions has a connection with the usage of time, treasure and talent. So if you can improve the ability of people's ability to make decisions that make better use of time, treasure and talent, the entire army, in the formal budgeted Lytton sense or the more organic sense, benefits immensely from that. And so what we can draw the conclusion is that with this decision making, it means that with low effective structures, we've got some room to grow in our capacity to make decisions, or the way in which we make decisions, or how nimbly we make decisions. That's the broad picture. So we need to move towards life-releasing decisions. So that sounds lovely and utopian. Let's try to unpack that a little bit, what we mean by life-releasing decisions, because we're not making things happen. When we put structures in place, we're never making something happen. We're at best supporting what God's already doing, or at worst, preventing it from happening. But we want to release decisions by the structures that are, release life by the decisions and structures we put in place. So I'll give you some examples to sort of fill in the picture of what we're talking about. So if we take the resources, so this is the resources available for your team, your division, whatever context you want to think of. So it's all the time, treasure and talent in a big, big bucket. Now, one approach is rigid decisions or structures. So this is where we set certain fixed policies related to certain things. We have generally blanket approaches that more or less somewhere near fit certain circumstances, and we can look up that minute, or we can go to that place and say this is a means by which we can make a particular decision to harness whatever resources we have available. And it's not the worst thing in the world. It's a bit clunky though. It's not very nuanced. And but if you want to maintain an organisation, then it will do, because you can set it somewhere in the middle of the road and you'll harness a bit of what's there and you'll keep things going even if the wheels are a bit square. At least it'll keep going. But what happens is, time and time again, millions of times every week, this is the tendency in such a situation. The resources are available. Some are focused towards life in part. So there's a little bit of life. There's something that comes as a result of it. We achieve something. But other stuff just sprays off into the atmosphere. It just disappears and we lose it. It goes away. It's no longer available to us. So this is time, this is treasure, this is talent that we're not harnessing because of lack of flexibility or ability to be responsive to the unique situation, that specific plant in at that level. Now we take the extreme contrast on the other end, we take the same pool of resources, and then we've got what I simply call the no decisions or no structures. So there's this endless procrastination or not making any decisions whatsoever. In that scenario, if you're lucky, you'll accidentally achieve something. Something will accidentally happen somewhere, and that's great. And we're singing hallelujah, that's terrific. But in the time that someone said, we've got this fantastic idea and I've pulled a team together, well, we've got a process and I'm not really sure how we can get that through. I'm not sure where that's going to happen, but we'll get back to you. And then a month goes by and 2 months go by, and the people are gradually wilting, their energy is disappearing, they're fading. And then eventually you come back and say, yes, we've made a decision. It's all a go. Oh, great. What were we doing again? What was that thing that we were going to be doing? Now, that's a bit of a caricature, and that never happens in the army. So I'm just borrowing that from other movements I work with. But nevertheless, we are familiar with those scenarios. So to make no decision is still to make a decision of sorts, and that is that resources which are alive and living and there will potentially vanish. Now, of course, you know, because I've done two, I'm now going to give the most utopian pixies and fairies and angels dancing in the heavenlies third option. We take the same pool of resources, and in this case, we apply life-releasing decisions and structures. So it doesn't fully fill it in all that well, because this parabola shape isn't a fixed shape. It's a flexible, dynamic shape that is responsive to what's happening at the time. That's the parabola that William Booth and others used in the early stages of the army. Highly flexible and responsive to what's in front of you right now. The gifts and abilities and the passion, or the opportunity that's opened up in a particular town, or this thing happening there, and having eyes to the new thing that God is doing in this place and responding accordingly. Not with no decisions, making decisions. You must do something with that, but doing it in such a way that it focuses it for the sake of life in all its fullness. And that's ultimately what we aim towards, is that we are harnessing the maximum amount possible towards life in all its fullness. So, how do we learn to consistently make life-releasing decisions? I am so glad you asked. Thank you for asking. That's the next obvious question, because that looks all very good in theory, but what on earth does that mean? And what possible guide can we have to try to do that better? Because at the moment, we have people disappearing out the back door, in part because we have to get better at that, at all layers of people and everywhere within the army. Thankfully, Jesus is a genius, and I like him for that. We know it's important to learn from the lilies, and Jesus tells us in Matthew 6:28, learn from the lilies how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. For some of us, we get to the end of a long day of ministry, and it's been hard. We've had some setbacks and challenges and some people grumbling and some difficult emails we've had to send, but we go home and, I was going to say go out in the garden, assuming you have your private gardener because you don't do the gardening, but you go out the back and you look at the lilies and your heart starts to fill up again and say, oh, this helps me to know God loves me. It's going to be okay. I'll turn in for the night. I'll wake up in the morning. The sun will come up and I'll face a new day of ministry. Well, that's nice. It's nothing remotely connected to what Jesus was saying, but if that floats your boat and works for you, that's great. What Jesus is saying here, the learn from here, is the Greek word katamantanos. Mantanos is to study very intently. Kata is an amplification of that. So rigorously and intensely study how the lilies of the field grow. So that's what he's saying in that context. And in the whole passage, here is how my kingdom works. If you want to see my kingdom come and to come in line with that and to be supportive of that, then rigorously study how the lilies of the field grow. Why? Because I made them. And on that basis, I've implanted within them the way that I want things to function. And it makes a lot of sense. If we're going to learn, as we should try to learn from other organisations and see how to do things better, it makes sense to learn from the most successful, fruitful, enduring organisation humankind has ever seen, and that is God's creation. It is the most fruitful, successful, enduring organisation ever. It is profound in its efficiency, its usage of resources, its harmonisation, its collaboration. If you walk into a rainforest, you don't have to have trucks backing up to a rainforest pouring in extra resources there. The connectedness of things and the cooperation of things and the connectedness is absolutely amazing. And in this verse, we effectively have Jesus saying, observe this, look at this. Some people think he used agrarian metaphors because it was just an agrarian society, like as if today he would give us, your iPad does something and thus is the way of the kingdom of God. It doesn't really make any sense that he would do that. It would seem to be agrarian because he's talking about living, breathing things, and we are living, breathing things. Our ministries, our teams are living, breathing things, so we should learn from the most effective living, breathing things. And one key that's very important to learn from the lilies of the field is that healthy living things make the best possible use of all that is available to them. That's the definition of a healthy living thing. Now, it's pre-lunch, and I'll have to get a little bit graphic now to illustrate the counterpoint to this. If I am a human being that is not particularly healthy, perhaps in the abdominal region, and if you put perfectly healthy food in my mouth, then possibly after some period of time, my unhealthy body will expel that food in one direction or another, because its inability to assimilate the food into the body means that it spews it out. That's the definition of it. If it's unhealthy, it can't take in, it can't make use of the resource that's available to it. Whereas if it's a healthy body, you can put all sorts of garbage in it. It's amazing. Usain Bolt, you can have a hamburger and run 100 metres in 9.69 seconds. It's extraordinary. So if it's a healthy body, it has an incredible capacity to flexibly integrate whatever's available. And so that's exactly what we need to become, because it's not exaggeration, it's not trying to be dramatic to say that an unhealthy organisation, unhealthy core, unhealthy centre, unhealthy denomination, whatever it happens to be, if it is unhealthy, it is a regurgitating, vomiting organism. Pleasant, huh? But that's exactly what happens. What is the back door of the church? It means... My father's a GP, so I grew up in this kind of realm of these strange dinner time conversations. Perfectly natural for me. But the incapacity for an organisation to make use of the gifts and abilities and unique passion of a particular person means we don't know what to do with you. We have no idea. We can't integrate that. So you will be ejected from this thing. You will drift out of this thing because we don't know what to do with you. So that's where the life-releasing decisions, as it happens in nature, comes into the picture. As Jesus has put it into his creation, that's how that functions, because we learn the ways of making use of these things that might seem odd to us, but in collaborative discussion and working with each other, we come up with creative solutions, saying, isn't that interesting? Who would have thought we could take that person with that unusual gift mix and passion and those ideas and look at what they're doing now? And most of us have got examples somewhere where we know that that's happened. Something big wacky has emerged and some new ministry's appeared, but rather than looking at that as, oh, isn't that odd? Isn't that out of the ordinary? To start to see that's probably a bit more normal than we'd like to think if we were truly tapped into the new work that God's doing. And our ability to address many more challenges in the world is automatically much higher. So, it's taking another step forward. How do we apply this? Now, we'll go through a few layers here, and then we'll come out at the Hallelujah chorus in terms of what I would like to work with the territory on to make exactly this happen. So we move to the topic of God's growth forces. Some of you familiar with the growth forces from NCD? You might have come across them, perhaps heard of them somewhere. Okay, so basically what happened is there's a guy called Frederick Bester, who was a multidisciplinary scientist in Germany, that did some studies into nature to work out what are the principles we can identify there that would be transferable to the political realm, to the business realm, to all sorts of societal realms that would help us solve a lot of the problems, because we're learning from, again, this most successful, enduring, fruitful organisation on the planet. So he went and looked at this and discovered a range of principles out of that. Christian Schwartz, the founder of NCD, came across that, and he worked with that a bit further because it wasn't entirely synthesised, and Christian did what he does, and he synthesised that further and ended up with what we now call the growth forces. So these are principles that consistently function in God's creation. So that original scientist, he wasn't coming from a Christian background, but he basically did exactly what Jesus said. Go study how the lilies of the field grow, see what you find out. He said, well, look at this. This is these principles that are always, always, always applying in God's creation. Some of the terms you may be familiar with, we won't go into them in great detail, but as we look through them a little bit, it might start to become clearer what they relate to. At one simple level, the top three have a strong affinity with how well things are done. So if we're making decisions, for some people there'll be a bias saying, I will always err on the side of making sure this is done well. The quality of what comes out of this decision is really important to me. That's what matters to me most. Other people at the table, and they're both equally important, other people at the table are saying, well, we can't sit around forever. We've got to get on with this. There's got to be a fruitfulness that comes out of this. There's got to be something happening as a result of this decision. We have to act on this now. And so how much gets done, or the quantity, is the part that is of greater concern for those people. And these are the sorts of things that are going through our minds subconsciously all the time in whatever decision we make. So I'm sitting down at the dinner table, I want to eat a lot or I want to eat well. And some people will err on the side of eating well, some people will err on the side of eating a lot. And if you're really hungry and malnourished, then eating a lot is probably not the worst thing in the world. If you're well-fed and rotund, then maybe looking at the quality of what you eat might be more useful. So if we step through then three basic decision-making components that come out of these principles that then apply to every decision we make every day of our life, as is made by the 10,000 people making the millions of decisions that are being made every single week within the Salvation Army. The first is that of outcomes. If you make a decision, there is something about an outcome. You want something to come as a result of the decision that you've made. But even within outcomes, there is a bias one way or the other. Both are equally important, but there will be a natural tendency for some people one way or the other. So on the one side, the outcome for some people is that we want better fruit. So the quality of fruit that we get in the next phase, it must be better. We must improve the quality of fruit that's coming, improve the quality of cadets that we have coming through, improve the quality of musicians we have, improve the quality of service that we provide to people in one of our centres. That's what we need to focus on. For other people saying, we need more trees, because more trees will be more fruit. So if we have more trees, we need to multiply this out and get more stuff happening. that's going to be my driving decision when I make, the driving factor when I'm making decisions about outcomes. So, to try to start the process of taking these abstract things and making them a bit more personal, just a simple show of hands. First of all, if you consider those two things generally, this is again not very scientific, but generally when you make decisions, which way do you sort of think you tend to go? Both equally important. So there's no, one's not superior to the other. They are both essential. So who tends to lean a little bit more towards the more trees? We need more outcome. There must be more outcome that comes from what we're trying to decide upon. Anyone lean a bit more that direction? Yep, a few people. Cool. Now, who leans a little bit more towards the better fruit? Okay, cool. So we've all got our little bit of tendency in the picture, and that will have an impact in every one of these cases. How effectively we use all the time, treasure and talent we have will come back to how well we make these decisions. Second one is the issue of timing. Timing is very critical in any decision and will have a huge impact on whether the decision ends up being fruitful and leads people to life in all its fullness, or is fruitless and actually achieves nothing terribly much at all. One end of the spectrum is the long-term tendency. So for these people, they're considering all the implications, the side effects, what might happen, how do we get multiple results from this decision, and really considering all the different little goat tracks that come out and possibilities from the decision. That's one important element. Equally important is the other side in terms of timing. It says, what do we have to do right now? There's energy sitting right in front of us. So here's brother Fred here sitting, and he's standing up, tick. He's got a pulse, tick. He's breathing, tick. Let's give him a ministry. So he's ticked all the criteria. We must get him doing something rather, because there's energy there in this person. We must activate that and do something now. And that's extremely important, because on the top end, you have the danger of analysis paralysis. You can endlessly pursue all the paths and all the possible considerations and never make any sort of decision at all, because you get so stuck with all the possible negative side effects. So you have to, at the same time, be considering what immediate effect can be had. What can we do right now? On the other side of it, if your only focus is on the immediate effect, you can end up with a very disintegrated situation. You can end up with departments that are busy doing different things, but nothing is integrated with anything else. There's just a whole lot of stuff getting done, and it's really not achieving a great deal. So, again, same question. I forgot to ask the second question before, sorry. So first question. For you personally, do you tend to lean more towards the long term? Put your hand up if you lean more towards the long term. And who leans more towards the immediate? Cool. Okay, great. Now, what about, so that was relatively balanced. Now, what about the army in general? Who feels that the army in general leans more towards the long-term consideration? And who thinks it relates more towards the immediate? Okay, so that's a fairly consistent picture we're getting over the multiple days. And immediately he points to and gives an indication of why we lose some of the time, treasure and talent we have, why some of it drifts out the back door. That's exactly the same dynamics, and those decisions are being made constantly, all the time. When we move to the third one, this is the topic of responsibility. So you've established the outcome that you want, or that you're trying to pursue. You've kind of worked out some timing, and the best timing for it, but you've still got to work out who's doing what, and how's this going to get done. And so in terms of responsibilities, on the one end of the spectrum, there are people who focus on, we need to make sure this keeps going, and that will depend upon me being clear on my responsibility and you being clear on your responsibility. So we make that very clear, we've each got our roles clarified, and we get on and do it. That's what we need to clarify. The other end of the spectrum is what we have responsibility for in collaboration, which means we can't individually actually achieve this particular result, so it will require at least some degree of collaboration to pool our abilities together in order to get a new result, or even a creative result that we wouldn't have otherwise come up with. So again, both are essential. In the one case, if you only collaborate, you won't sustain anything. If you only focus on the individual tasks and work on your individual particular roles, you won't have the collaborative, collective effect that comes from combining your understanding and abilities. So, same question, which way do you lean personally? Who leans more towards, when it comes to responsibilities, focusing on what we need to collaborate on together? Okay, few people. Who focuses more on clarifying clearly what you have to do and clarifying what other people have to do? Cool. Okay, that's great. Now, what about the army generally? Who feels that the army focuses more on the end of the collaboration side? Okay, and who feels that the army focuses more on the clarification of the individual responsibilities of each person? Okay, cool. So, in as much as there is any degree of imbalance in those things, again, time, treasure and talent is disappearing. So, if it is that if collaboration is not quite so strong, as the hands would sort of indicate a bit, then the combination of people's gifts is being lost, the power that can come from that collaborative working together and finding solutions in that way. All right, so this is all, you know, in one sense, I get excited about it, but, you know, for some, it's not the most exciting thing in the world, except that all we're doing here is saying Jesus said very clearly in the Bible, the text is, study how the lilies of the field grow and see what you can learn from that, see what you can glean from that. And so we're trying to do that because this will inform the decisions we make and adjust the way that we make decisions. What I'm quite excited about, and what I'll be working on as soon as I land back in Brisbane to bring to completion, is that we have been working on a stewardship test, which is in beta testing, which first of all means my children do it, to make sure it can be done by children, and then we expand from there. We're continuing to test that, and the whole idea with this is that by completing 60 questions for a particular person, you can find out what is your decision-making tendency, which in summary means in what ways are you in danger of leaking time, treasure and talent from the decisions you make, and in what ways do you make good decisions that are very helpful. And then you take it to the team level, and the whole team does it. You combine the results and say, as a team, when we sit together making decisions, this is the stuff we do really well, and this is the stuff where we perhaps don't even ask the question. So in this case, the interdependence, if this was a team somewhere or a group somewhere, a team in the Salvation Army, if interdependence is the low point there's certain questions we don't even tend to ask when making a decision. What are those questions? We should add those into the mix to make sure that we are maximising the use of the time, treasure and talent that we have available in this. Now, one of the huge spin-offs that comes out of this is that there's always contention about decision-making processes, particularly where you have some people that have higher responsibilities and some that have lower responsibilities. Someone makes a decision and others say, I don't understand why the decision was made, they should have done this, blah, blah, blah. It goes around in these different circles. In large part because people are simply trying to figure out what was the criteria for that decision. But then if you said to them, what's the criteria for your decision? Oh, I had an idea and it's great. Well, that's not the most ironclad criteria for making a decision. It might be good, it might be bad, we don't know. But if we're not really sure on the criteria for life-releasing decisions, it breeds an environment of skepticism and mistrust and all sorts of things that is just not productive. And then you can have people in higher positions that can feel a bit anxious and have stress about making certain decisions because they maybe think, I don't know if it's a great idea, but I'm not even sure how we would explain to them entirely that they would understand that it could be better, and vice versa. And there's obviously loads of that happens in the army. So in any context, a common language is always beneficial to reduce misunderstandings. But if you can combine a common language, then with a diagnostic sobriety for each person, a diagnosed sobriety to say, okay, I'm aware that I'm not so hot on the interdependence part. I don't naturally think of those parts. So before I even shoot my idea off to DHQ or THQ, I'm going to join with the other person, even in my own team, Mary over here, who hardly says anything, but as an actual fact is incredible with thinking through the repercussions of things. And so I'm going to say, Mary, please speak up. We need your input on this to really clarify what this is about. Because so many times decisions end up being made with a natural bias towards the loudest voices in the room or where the greatest influence is. And that sometimes bears no correlation with the capacity of that person to think through the necessary parts of decision making. So you end up in all sorts of troubling situations along the way. So what excites me about this is that, again, within the next couple of months this will be available, to begin using this in teams and departments with individuals of all kinds and all sorts of levels of the army to start to bring a little bit of a common language to that decision-making process and to help teams to recognise the questions they don't naturally ask all against the backdrop of saying we're doing this because we're tired of hemorrhaging time, treasure and talent. We don't want to lose that. And we also want to have a consistency of understanding about how decisions are made. And we're not pinning it to someone's great idea about how to make decisions. We're ultimately pinning it to the way that God's own creation functions. And therefore, it's the most reliable benchmark about the usage of time, treasure and talent. Because by definition, that's what God's creation does best. So, as I say, this tool will help individuals and teams at all levels of Salvation Army ministry to more fully harness time, treasure and talent for releasing life around them. And I get excited about that. And so I'm really looking forward to working with some of the guys, THQ and DHQ, and saying, okay, let's just start piloting this and looking at how this can function and just really grow the confidence for decision making within the army, because there's sometimes a lot of insecurity about making decisions, and as soon as that happens it slows everything down. Whereas if you can become more nimble, we couldn't, if you try to imagine the rate of decision making involved in the peak point of growth within the Salvation Army, it was just mind-boggling how fast it must have been in order to produce the fruit that was there. Now, are they just lucky? Flip a coin, oh cool, it's always landing on the right side of the coin. But there's an understanding that seems to be almost supernatural about the way that God does things, and it permeated what they did. Okay, so I look forward to bringing that along the way. Now, I've got a little more I'd like to explore with you, and then we'd like to round out today with more discussion time with you guys to sort of process these things through, and you can call me over if there's things you want to ask about, and just really to try to drill this stuff down further. But if we come back to overall theme, taking the lost and found on a journey to life, there's an important question that we should have a quick look at, and that is, where does the journey to life take place? Where does it mostly take place? Some of that journey to life takes place in the context of specific organised activities within centres and core. We know that's part of it. We want to do the best job we possibly can. But in reality, there's a lot of that journey to life for any individual person that has to take place outside of that, because in most cases we don't have people with us all the time in all of those spaces. So how can we, from that perspective, dramatically increase the number of people that make that journey and how far they make that journey? So we can start this with the question, where the journey is lived out. How much time does the average core attendee spend in core organised activities? I'm focusing on core, and you can alter that for your particular centre, and I think you'll still make the same point. But how much time does the average core attendee spend in core organised activities? I'm taking a stab at this and saying, in really round terms, let's assume people get reasonable sleep, they're awake for about 100 hours of the week, and I'll say maybe 10 of those hours are involved in going to a meeting, going to a small group, going to a fellowship thing, having lunch, whatever else. Something's been organised and they're part of that. So let's say that it's about 10% or 10 hours in the week that they're spending in those organised activities. That, of course, then means that they are spending in other activities 90% of their time. So that's a very, very, very large differential that, at least at some level, should be looked at to consider what impact does that have on whatever we're trying to do, because most of what we're trying to do is in that 10%. And the theory goes that what we're trying to do is that there's a wave that comes, there's influence. We want to grow something, we want to transform people's lives, activate them, send them out the front door, do stuff with people in that 10% of the time. And ideally, the good health of a core, and sadly the bad as well, flows out and influences the rest of the week. That's what we want to do. We say the benediction, and we play the last song, and we send them out the door and say, go change the world. And we want that to flow out and have an influence. But of course, at the same time, the good and the bad of the rest of life flows in and influences the core. So we've all experienced this. If there are dramas or difficulties or marriage breakdowns or various tragedies of all kinds, and also celebrations of good things, that flow in from that 90% and have an input into life. You can stand behind the pulpit and you watch people come in maybe on a Sunday and you're just wondering what's going to flow through the door, what you might contend with on that particular day. And those things are washing over everything that's happening. So if you're focused in a process of trying to improve the quality of small groups, and you're wanting to steward the time, treasure and talent better, or you're generally trying to improve the health and fruitfulness within those activities, you're hoping to goodness that that big wave is a favourable big wave, that there's good things happening out there, or suddenly all your good work over here is getting diluted by whatever is flowing in great measure through that 90% of time. So it's not an insignificant consideration to look at, and it is often a cause of immense frustration that can pour into the life of your ministry. So, how can we unleash the life-releasing principles of God beyond our organised activities to amplify the fruitfulness of our core and centres and thereby transform the world? That's the question I wanted to ask, wasn't it? Yes, of course. You're formulating that in your mind. Because this is what we want to aim for. We have that part. How can we address that? So what I want to just introduce to you is, again, another project. It's been 7 years or more in development. It will launch this year. And it is called the My Oikos Project. So to give a little bit of a picture on this, this is you or someone that you know, some person in your ministry context. And you or this person is surrounded by various other different people and connected with in some way through the course of life. Some of those people you might be in a work team with, so you work with them through the week. Others you might be in a tennis team, a sport team, clearly not a gardening group, but a sporting team of some description that you are joined with those people, and you're also part of a core or centre or something. So you're surrounded by these people and you're involved with them in different parts of life. In addition to people that you're formally involved with in different groups, there's a couple of people that come along the picture that you just like to hang out with. You don't have a formal connection with them, they may be friends or family or something, and you just like to be with them. Out of all of these people, there's a special group, and they are the people who most need you and who you most need. It is your sphere of influence. It is a particular group where the relational dynamics are strongest in that space. And in biblical terminology, we would call that an oikos. Some of you are familiar with the concept of oikos. So oikos simply means household in the original Greek. But in our modern language, we'd have to probably say extended household, because in their terms it was the family and it was the workers and the various people. So this is this group of people. Now, the special thing about an oikos is that everyone has one. Everyone on the planet is part of an oikos. And it is the one social unit that you cannot leave, because it extends from you, from your sphere of influence. You can join and leave a local core. You can join and leave a ministry. You can join and leave a department. You can join and leave a business. You can join and leave all these things that are an institutional form, but you can't leave your oikos. It will follow you. The people in it will change, potentially over time, but it is the most basic unit that you're in all of your life. So the only decision you have is, what are you going to do with it? So the Oikos project is taking the principles of NCD and applying them simply to the Oikos, which means in that 90% of time that people are outside of formal activities, we are able to support them and develop them so that they can nurture and care for their own oikos, which has a couple of benefits. Obviously, it means they are applying the principles in a much larger part of their life and therefore constantly getting better at harnessing the time, treasure and talent available to them. But on the other side, it means that there can be a renewed focus for core and centres, because if you are part of a core, for example, and as an extension of that core, you've got a certain number of people that attend that core, 50 people that attend. Every one of those people has their own oikos. And if you add up the additional people who are in those different oikoi, it's the plural, then that number is much larger than 50 people. And this is not an artificial reality. You have a relational connection, an influence connection to those people, even if they're not part of your core. They have an influence that flows into your core, and your core has an influence into their lives, even if they don't attend the core. And the beauty is, if they're involved in such a process, you're able to find out what is the minimum factor of this collective oikos. And this is a cool part, because the collective oikos is the paroikia, the parish. That's the meaning of it, is the collective oikos, the collective household that is connected with a core. So this could be 50 people in a core, and it could be 400 people in the paroikia. And they're all interrelated and influencing each other, even though they don't turn up, say, on a Sunday. but the ability to find out what are the greatest needs that people have in that paroikia. And then the centre or the core says, well, it only makes sense that we should shape and adjust our structures and programs to support what is going on in this wider sphere. So this is like taking need-oriented evangelism and thoroughly putting it on steroids. So this is like going what the army was born to do to meet the needs of people and speak the gospel into that, and stretching it literally to the ends of the earth, because every single person has an oikos and they have a starting point. And one of the keys within this is to be mindful that in Jesus' own ministry, discipleship began before decision. People were disciples before they were confessing that Jesus was Lord. And so to help people on that journey, where they begin to learn effectively from Jesus the way that life functions, how to make life work, which was the main thing of Jesus' message. He didn't introduce all that much new teaching. He just said, this is how life works. Oh, I didn't notice that. And I said, wow, he speaks with such authority, simply because he was telling the truth about how life actually works. And so if your core or centre is helping people... I think the recording stopped. I'll try starting it again. All of this together comes back to our theme. As I talked about, the notion of homelessness or of building a home would be a fantastic way to understand the overall work of everyone involved in the Salvation Army. So addressing homelessness and putting a roof over people and putting food in their mouth is one piece of that building of the home. But if you then create a nurturing environment where people's gifts are developed and they're deployed and they're released and they're able to live out their potential in Christ, then you have created the next part of that home. The ultimate picture is that you continue on that journey until they find themselves in the new creation, the home of God, God's oikos, God's household is ultimately where we're leaning to. So as a guiding framework to think of every one of our ministries about building the home of God, both in quantity and quality, a place where people can grow and to come home into the presence of God. On the theme of oikos, of course, being about home, there's some, for me, exciting, literally world-changing implications that relate to this, because the term oikos has an incredible connection with some of the largest problems faced in the world today. And if we're committed to becoming a movement that develops the quality of home and finds a place for people in the home, we have an ability to speak into some of the biggest challenges that are there. So we take the word oikos, and then we have a quick little look at what this idea of home, I talked about the primary nature of the group and how powerful it is in the church context, but the basis of the household as the fundamental unit of society comes through very strongly in this. We look at these words that are based on oikos. Oikologia. Does anyone know oikologia? Oikologia is ecology. The entire realm of ecology is about studying your oikos. If you read most media, you would get the picture. It's about measuring the plants and flowers and the water and whatever else. That's a part of the picture. But ecology at its base is about studying the oikos. That's the foundation of what it is. So ecology is the discipline that obeys Matthew 6:28. Jesus says, see how the lilies of the field grow. So study how the household looks. And in doing like NCD surveys or whatever else, this is part of that discipline of saying we must study the household. We've got to get a better picture of what's going on here. We've got to look at A, B, C, D, E, and F and put our hands up and try to evaluate what's going on in the household so that it can be improved. The extraordinary thing about the whole world, if you're into it at all, the whole ecological picture, I collect articles on different things. And how do we get more renewable energy? How do we do this? How do we do that? I haven't found a single article yet anywhere, and I collect lots of them, that says the best way to deal with the environmental problems of the world is to help people to get on with each other. I haven't found a single one yet. And yet it's the most obvious answer to everything, because every environmental problem comes from the basis that people can't get on with each other. So when I was born, the average household size in Australia was 3.3 people. It's now 2.2 people. The fastest growing household type is single person households. So over time, people's ability to even live with each other gets smaller and smaller, which means tons more houses, tons more resource needed, tons more roads, tons more forest knocks down. Every possible level is destroyed simply because, Fred won't live with his mother-in-law, basically. That's, what it sort of boils down to. So you won't see this. And of course, secular materialist sort of people. Secular materialists that are perhaps anti-religious in nature, of course, aren't going to start talking about the spiritual factors related to helping people get on with each other to deal with the environmental challenges of the world. So there's lots of smart people talking about environmental things, but the level of the discussion is profoundly dumb because it just completely excludes that element of it. And the Salvation Army has an ability to speak into that in a profound way that no one's even talking about. The healing of the home is a fundamental way of transforming the environmental issues that we face. 1. Oikonomia. You may have come across this if you've studied any Greek, because it's a biblical term. Oikonomia is economics. And it simply means manage your oikos. So when we read the news about the stock market crash and what the world economist is predicting that we should do and whether interest rates should go up and down, I feel so warmed in my heart that their major concern is to help me to manage my household. That's the number one thing that matters to them. And I thank God that their focus is so clearly on that. It's so absurd, it's just ridiculous. It's just beyond imagination that we would call those people, obviously, yes, I'll be gracious to them, but that we would call them economists. When an economist is a single mum in her home trying to pay the bills and make it work and use a little bit of money and time and whatever, that's an economist making life work. That's who we're trying to support. That's who we're trying to help in the ministry that we say, let's help you put your house together. And why do you do that? We want you to be part of our household and together we'll make this work. We will be proper economists, oikonomists. We will be economists that put things together in that way. And then we will laugh a little bit because we'll cure the problems that the so-called economists are printing money and doing goodness knows what to try to actually solve those things. So the power to speak into that is immense. Maybe that's something you're interested in, maybe not. Doesn't matter, because if we solve the homeless issue and develop that in the army, we will automatically have an impact upon that. We go a little bit further. Of course, the direct connection in our current topic from today is stewardship and effective structure. So as we improve in that, we automatically help people to become better economists, better managers of the household, be it their team, be it their family's household, wherever that happens to be. That's what we are healing. We move on to the next one, oikodome. So Paul talks about everything is permissible, but not everything edifies. The term edify there is oikodome, which means build up the household. So Paul's criteria is not everything's permissible, and as long as it sort of edifies you, it's okay. So no, the context is the household. So you can choose to do different things, but only on the basis that it would build up your household and the people around you. So all things are permissible. There's all sorts of possibilities there, but building that up, nurturing, developing people, because what we could simply say is that oikodome means development, or develop your oikos. This has an enormous part to speak into education or re-education in one level. So where people come into our context, we want to help them to be educated to understand a better way of doing things. It has a huge influence on the ailing education system in countries, but re-education in terms of people coming through, have gone into prison, and the attempts within the prison systems to try to re-educate people and help them move back into society. Well, oikodome is the idea of nurturing people and helping them to be transformed and grown in that way. Again, direct connection with our community and holistic small groups, building up and edifying and growing people to their fullest potential. And this, of course, is a cycle that keeps going, because as soon as we take those steps, we study the oikos, we see what's happening, we take action and we steward what we have better in order to resolve things. We then move into the space of saying, let's develop people beyond their current point and further along their journey to life to their potential. Once we've done that, we've got to keep evaluating, keep seeing what's happening, keep looking at what's going on and make that assessment. And that leads us to the scope of what we are aiming at here. And this should expand our horizons enormously. The final oik word is oikomeni. Oikomeni mostly is translated as ecumenical, which again is a travesty, because you think of ecumenical and you've got the bishop of the something church meeting the general of the Salvation Army, and they shake hands and promise to get on with each other. Say, well, that's nice, that's better than war, but it's It's not particularly world-changing, but oikomeni means the whole inhabited world. It is the world as a household, which is ultimately when Jesus comes into that and transforms it through his people, it is God's household, the whole creation. It is salvation, meaning creation is healed. That is the scope of what we can be involved in simply by addressing. It's not an extra thing. It's not on top of the things we talked about earlier. It's the logical conclusion of just doing exactly the things we talked about earlier and the on-flow all by itself effect that comes from all of that. So I've been banging on with some of these bits for many years, some more recently because I didn't have any idea about them. But for me, I'm sort of in for the long haul because I look at the principles of NCD, I look at the connections with the army's work, and I'm like the disciples, Jesus says, are you going to go as well? And I say, well, where else would I go? You've got the words of eternal life. So there's dark days and times that don't go so well, and you get amazing frustration about things that happen, but you can't turn away from it because you say, it's not going away. No matter what, this has got to get addressed, and if we do, then there's immense possibilities to flow from that. So to round out our time, and we'll probably be able to have a bit of an early mark as well, I'd really like it if you happen to be here with your team, if you were able to get together with your specific team, or if you're sort of here a little bit lonely, you might want to join on with another team or one of the THQ guys or something, and to simply go through a number of questions, to really talk it out, to try to work out what in practical terms can be done about all this stuff. And I'll be keen if you want to have a chat about anything and explore it further, because it's all, I hope, a reasonable amount of it resonates with you and your experiences and the things that have to happen, but it's all just talk unless we can make it practical in the simplest possible ways. No grand plans, but what do we do the next day we turn up at work or the next time we sit with our teams that starts to make the change and has the effect that we want. So we've got a range of different questions to explore. You may have other ones you want to go to, so this is just catalytic. But please, if you would just move into your particular teams or groups now and start having a chat through those, and call me over or one of the other guys over if you'd like to thrash some things out. The last things, I just wanted to close with these again to remind us of this, simply that we allow not just the imagine, but the reality that this can happen. There's nothing fatalistic about anything. The principles that established and made possible what we know in the history books of what happened through the army are the same principles that apply level. That lower layer remains the same. The upper layer is wildly different, but the lower layer remains the same. So there's no reason to not have expectation of dramatically new and fresh things happening around the army world. And sometimes we go, Adam, he's such an idealist. I say, no, come on, let's have the stoush. Let's talk about it. Let's go to data. Let's look at the actual picture of what can happen here. Please prove me wrong. Otherwise, I'm standing firm by that. Which means a magnificent picture. And I don't know, I just put this in there that if you are speaking with core, or if you're DMEs or whoever is speaking with core, you may just end up starting the conversation even just with this sort of picture. And that's why, for me, in the desire to let people have the freedom to come to the principles without coercion, I've continued for years and years and years to work out how do you tap into what matters to people. Don't force them to speak NCD language or whatever else, but to say, here's the territorial picture. Okay, you've been in the army for a while. Can you relate to this? And chances are they've got a child or a friend or someone that has gone out the back door, and it's the start of a dialogue. And we don't force you into NCD language. We say, as a territory, we're trying to address this. And as your local core, do you ever sense this is the case? Their profile might be different, but more times than not, it will probably resonate something with that. So it's a potential starting point that goes to the issues that matter to them. So they might be front door people. Yes, that's great. But if the back door issue is there, then it's a challenge. So maybe if nothing else, simply having that in front of people as a talking point for discussion could be good. And then, of course, in the final analysis, our capacity to do this in far greater measure, it excites me enormously when I know and you get the little hints of the capacity and potential that exists even in the people still around, the breadth of what we could be doing and the things we could be conquering and society transforming things we could be doing are just amazing. So I hope to in some way or another continue to track with you on the journey of it all. as we keep going forwards. And I thank you very much for all of your time, and really appreciate it.